Hey guys, tonight we ride together beneath a sprawling, star-speckled steppe sky. You settle deep into the worn saddle, feeling its well-polished leather creak slightly beneath your weight. Around you stretches an endless ocean of wind-blown grass, whispering gently as it rustles in the cool evening breeze. Your horse moves rhythmically, each step blending into the next, lulling you into a relaxed state of comfort. You're almost drifting off when a pang of hunger reminds you it's time for dinner. Without missing a beat, you reach beneath the saddle, yes, right beneath you, and retrieve a tough, slightly warm strip of meat. Salty, leathery, and cured by sweat and friction, it's definitely not Michelin star fare, but it's dinner tonight. Let's face it, if the thought of eating something tenderized by your horse makes you cringe, you probably won't survive this journey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to comment your location and local time. I'm always curious where you folks drift off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You chew methodically, savoring or perhaps tolerating the intensely salty, leathery texture. This is borts, dried meat, the Mongol warriors' go-to snack, survival ration, and sometimes armor accessory. A bit bizarre, yes, but brilliantly practical. You see, the Mongol Empire didn't conquer vast swaths of Eurasia merely by superior archery and horsemanship. Their unprecedented mobility hinged on ingenious methods of preparing, preserving, and consuming food. Every ounce of energy and every strip of meat mattered when your life depended on covering enormous distances at lightning speed. So what's the saddle-cured jerky all about? Mongol horsemen typically cut fresh meat, usually mutton, occasionally beef or horse, into thin strips. These strips were then placed beneath their saddles, right between rider and mount. The friction, pressure, and body heat combined to soften and partially dehydrate the meat. No open flames, no pots, just sheer ingenuity using the resources at hand, or under saddle if we're being literal. And historians still argue whether this technique truly cooked the meat or merely tenderized it to chewable consistency. Whatever the scientific reality, for practical Mongols, it worked wonders. Consider the steppe environment: dry air, hot summers, bitterly cold winters, and minimal wood or fuel sources. Cooking traditionally, roasting, boiling, grilling, was a luxury few warriors could afford in enemy territory. Fire meant smoke, smoke meant detection, and detection typically meant disaster. Saddle curing avoided all those issues, providing sustenance without betraying position. Genius, if somewhat unappetizing to modern sensibilities. Let's be real, there's probably a reason saddle-cured jerky isn't trending on TikTok. Now imagine weeks, even months, traveling through remote grasslands, mountain passes, deserts, and tundra. With no towns, markets, or reliable hunting grounds, your own saddle became a portable pantry. Strips of borts stashed there, combined with a leather flask of fermented milk, could sustain a rider indefinitely, or at least until the next battle. Mobility was everything for Mongol armies, and thus every soldier carried exactly what they needed and no more. This minimalist approach was crucial to their phenomenal military success. Interestingly, the dominant meat in Mongol saddlebags was usually mutton, thanks to their herds of hardy sheep. These animals provided meat, milk, wool, and dung used for cooking fires when circumstances allowed. Sheep required less grazing land and were better adapted to the sparse steppe vegetation compared to cattle. This practicality shaped the Mongol diet profoundly. Mutton was nutrient-dense, calorie-efficient, and easy to preserve by drying. Horse meat, on the other hand, was prestigious, highly nutritious, and eaten less frequently by the common soldier. It was typically reserved for special occasions, signaling status within the hierarchical Mongol society. Foreign travelers like Marco Polo and William of Rubruck observed these practices with mixed amazement and mild horror. Polo wrote vividly of Mongol warriors sustaining themselves for days or weeks on dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and little else. He noted how incredibly disciplined and hardy these warriors appeared, thriving despite what seemed, to European sensibilities, a severely limited diet. Such accounts fascinated and sometimes unsettled Western readers who wondered how the Mongols avoided nutritional deficiencies without fresh vegetables, fruits, or grains. You might also wonder, how exactly did these warriors maintain health on a diet so limited in variety? Modern nutritional science has shed light on this mystery. Freshly butchered meat, especially organ meats eaten raw or lightly boiled, provided ample vitamin C, preventing scurvy, a constant threat to travelers. Mare's milk, fermented into a fizzy, probiotic-rich beverage known as kumis or arag, supplied beneficial bacteria, essential nutrients, and hydration. These seemingly simple dietary solutions, perfected through trial, error, and generational knowledge, ensured Mongol soldiers could sustain demanding physical exertion under brutal environmental conditions. And what about seasoning? While Mongols favored simplicity, they occasionally supplemented their meals with foraged wild onions, garlic, or other edible plants gathered during brief stops. Women often took charge of this foraging, ensuring variety, medicinal properties, and flavor enhancements, even in the harshest conditions. These additions, modest though they were, greatly enriched an otherwise monotonous menu. By this point, as the saddle beneath you gently rocks you back and forth, your initial skepticism towards the meat fades slightly, just slightly, as appreciation replaces curiosity. Every tough bite connects you to generations of nomadic ingenuity. As bizarre as saddle-cured jerky seems to modern taste buds, its brilliance lies in sheer simplicity, effectiveness, and complete alignment with the Mongol way of life. It kept warriors mobile, alert, and ready, allowing them to outmaneuver opponents reliant on cumbersome supply lines and cooking fires. This practical, portable cuisine shaped an empire, underpinning astonishing military triumphs from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Europe. It transformed humble sheep herds into dynamic marching pantries. It enabled an seemingly endless series of campaigns, conquests, and territorial expansions unmatched before or since. It even impressed skeptical foreign observers who, despite initial revulsion, couldn't deny its efficiency and effectiveness. Tonight, beneath the quiet stars, you ride in the Mongols' footsteps, experiencing firsthand the simplicity and rugged practicality of their diet. The grassland horizon stretches infinitely ahead, the Milky Way above guiding you onward, and the salty toughness of your saddle-cured jerky fueling each step. This is history at its rawest, most authentic, and occasionally most unappetizing, but without question, utterly ingenious. You shift slightly in the saddle, licking the salt from your fingertips after finishing the last bite of bortz. But the dryness clings to your throat like steppe dust, and you instinctively reach for something to wash it down. Hanging from the saddle horn is a sloshing leather bag, round, soft, and alive with a faint fizz. You uncap it and take a swig. It's tangy, cold, and slightly effervescent. It almost tastes alive. This is irag, the Mongols' iconic fermented mare's milk, and you'll be drinking a lot of it. It might not sound like a dreamy beverage for bedtime, but trust me, if you're spending your life in the saddle across thousands of kilometers of wilderness, irag is practically magic. It hydrates, it feeds, it even fizzes a little, like a medieval energy drink crossed with yogurt and champagne. And if that sounds like a horrible combination, well, you're not wrong. But it worked. It worked astonishingly well. This peculiar drink begins its life with a mare, one of the most prized animals in the Mongol herds. Not just for riding, mind you, but for her milk. Mare's milk is notably different from cows. It's higher in lactose, lower in fat, and curiously well-suited for fermentation. The Mongols would milk the mares during the warm months, usually summer, when the animals were lactating, and pour the liquid into large leather bags called hukur. These bags weren't just containers, they were fermentation chambers and churns all in one. Each time someone passed by the hukur, they were expected to give it a good whack or shake, a kind of team effort brewing system. Inside, the milk churned vigorously and wild bacteria and yeasts did their sacred work. The result? Lactic acid and alcohol. That's right. Irog is mildly alcoholic, usually somewhere around 2-3%, with a frothy carbonated texture that dances on the tongue. It could be stored for days, sometimes longer in cooler weather, and was always on hand in times of thirst, hunger, celebration, or even solemn ritual. Historians still debate just how alcoholic the original Irog was. Some claim it was stronger than modern reconstructions suggest. Others point to elite variants like Kara kumis, a distilled black kumis that packed a real punch and was often reserved for nobles or ceremonial feasts. But for the average rider like you, regular Irog was more than enough to lift spirits, hydrate the body, and keep the belly working during long stretches between meals. It also came with surprising health benefits. Modern studies have shown that Irog contains a healthy blend of probiotics, lactic acid bacteria and yeasts that promote gut health, help break down lactose, and even offer mild antibacterial properties. In the absence of refrigeration or clean water supplies, a naturally fermented beverage like this could be a lifesaver. Literally. Mongol riders could carry it in sloshing bags on their saddles, drinking whenever needed. And unlike water drawn from random rivers or wells, often contaminated, Irog's acidity kept it relatively safe. More than just a drink, though, Irog was steeped in symbolism. It played a central role in ceremonies, offerings, oaths, and hospitality. Sprinkling a bit of Irog into the air or on the ground was a way to honor the spirits, the eternal blue sky, Tengri, the ancestors, the land itself. Before feasting or battle, before sealing brotherhoods or forging alliances, Mongols would raise a bowl of Irog in solemn ritual. You weren't just consuming calories, you were partaking in the sacred. And yet Irog wasn't the only dairy marvel in the Mongol toolkit. Summer was the season of white foods, a whole category of milk-based products that made up the bulk of the warm season diet. Butter, cheese, yogurt, clotted cream, and above all, karut, rock-hard dried curds that rattled in pouches and lasted for months. But we'll get to that crunchy delight in a later section. Tonight, we're sticking with the fizzy stuff. Let's pause for a second to appreciate the image. You're bouncing along the steppe on horseback, slurping lightly alcoholic fermented mare's milk from a goat leather pouch, while your jerky tenderizes under your saddle. You smell like smoke, sweat, and horse. Your bones rattle with every gallop, and you feel fantastic. This was the Mongol rhythm: ride, raid, drink, rest, repeat. But Irog also had limitations. It didn't last forever, especially in the hotter months. Once fully fermented, it could sour beyond palatability in just a few days. That's why it had to be drunk quickly, shared communally, and replenished constantly. In fact, the act of offering Irog to a guest was not just polite, it was essential. Mongol hospitality revolved around this frothy drink. Turn it down, and you risked more than offending your host. You risked spiritual insult. William of Rubric, a European friar who visited the Mongol courts in the 1250s, described Irog with a mix of fascination and stomach-turning bewilderment. He noted its sour taste, its intoxicating fizz, and how Mongols consumed it with visible pleasure. For him, it was a novelty. For them, it was survival and ritual. In some cases, it served as medicine. Sick individuals were sometimes prescribed specific forms of fermented dairy. And on the battlefield, Irog offered warriors a refreshing energy source when water wasn't an option and fire couldn't be risked.
It didn't require boiling, was pre-fermented, read self-sterilized, and even provided small quantities of vitamin C, critical for staving off scurvy in a largely vegetable-free diet. But it wasn't just the milk. It was the whole ecosystem. Horses were central. You needed a mare capable of milking. You needed a culture of fermentation, literally and figuratively. You needed a society that understood the rhythms of lactation, climate, spoilage, and sustenance. And Mongols had that. It was in their blood, passed from mother to child, from elder to apprentice. Food wasn't just about eating. It was about knowing. So you tuck the leather flask back on the saddle horn, your lips tingling from the sour sparkle. You wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve and glance at the distant horizon. A caravan stirs far off, shimmering in the heat haze. Your gut feels just a little stronger. Your mind just a little lighter. And somewhere, in the strange mix of fermentation and warrior grit, you begin to understand why the Mongols didn't just survive the steppe, they conquered it. The wind picks up slightly. A bird calls out overhead. Your horse shifts beneath you. And as you press forward into the night, you ride not just with history, but with the living taste of it still on your tongue.
By now, your saddle's become more than a seat. It's a kitchen counter, a butcher's block, and a slightly smelly food dehydrator. And as your horse lopes gently through the tall grass, you catch a faint whiff of something meaty. That's not your imagination. Slung beneath your saddle flap, stretched into thin leather ribbons, is a stash of raw meat, slowly drying into jerky. This is borts, again, but in a more interactive stage of development. Forget campfires and cast iron. In the Mongol pantry, the wind was your oven, the sun your flame. And your horse? Well, let's just say the poor thing did more than carry you. The meat beneath your saddle is getting slowly cured by body heat, friction, and air movement. While it might sound horrifying to modern food inspectors, it worked astonishingly well. Mongol warriors weren't foodies, they were survivors, and jerky in the armpit was part of the plan. Now, not every piece of boards was made under a saddle. That's just one, somewhat legendary method. The more common approach was straightforward and smart. Slice meat, usually mutton, horse, or game, into long, thin strips. Hang those strips inside a ger, or yurt, on ropes strung from wall to wall. Let the dry steppe air do the rest. With humidity low and wind plentiful, the steppe was a giant dehydrator. This process didn't need salt or smoke, although both were sometimes added when available. The goal wasn't flavor, it was survival. Remove moisture, prevent bacteria, and create a meat product that could last weeks, even months, without rotting. The resulting borts was tough, chewy, and lightweight, like a medieval protein bar with hooves. Still, the saddle curing method sticks in the imagination for good reason. Picture it. You're riding 10 hours a day through scorching sun and freezing nights, eating what you carry and carrying what you eat. Every piece of gear has to multitask. So why not turn your transportation into a slow cooker? Some historians believe this method may have started as a joke or necessity, like storing raw meat under the saddle to warm it slightly before eating, before evolving into a deliberate preservation tactic. Others argue it was more folklore than fact. Historians still argue whether meat placed under the saddle was intentionally cured or simply tenderized for quick eating. Either way, the story stuck, and it paints a vivid picture of how intertwined food and movement were in Mongol life. Once dried, borts was incredibly practical. Just a few strips could provide the core of a meal. To eat it, you could chew it raw in emergencies, or ideally, grind it down and rehydrate it in a bit of hot water. Add some millet if you had it, maybe a lump of dried milk curd. We'll get to that soon. And you've got a hot, protein-rich stew. The Mongols even carried small stone pauldrons or leather pouches that doubled as boiling bags.
ready to turn borts into broth at a moment's notice. Marco Polo wrote that 10 pounds of this dried meat could sustain a rider for 10 days. That's 1 pound per day. But keep in mind, without water or added fat, borts isn't exactly gourmet. But it was calorie-dense, light to carry, and could be shared or rationed easily. And thanks to the dry air of the steppe, spoilage was rare. There's a kind of genius to it, turning every moment of the journey, including the parts when you're just bouncing in the saddle, into a chance to prepare food. You weren't just traveling, you were curing your dinner as you went. Imagine a modern soldier seasoning meat in their boots while marching, and you're only halfway to grasping the madness meets efficiency of it all. But Mongols didn't stop at sheep or horse. Wild game, deer, marmots, foxes, and boar was also turned into jerky. Marmot, in particular, was a steppe favorite. And yes, there is a somewhat unfortunate cooking method involving marmots and hot stones that we'll touch on in another section. Spoiler alert, it's weird. But with borts, the goal was universal. Maximum calories, minimum weight, maximum portability. Even the choice of meat was strategic. Mutton, with its high fat content, could supply both energy and insulation in cold weather. Horse meat was richer and more elite, but it also contained more iron and protein. The fat from both, when rendered, was often stored separately as a kind of energy gel. Seriously, imagine dipping your dried meat in warm sheep fat after a long day of conquest. Bon appetit. Interestingly, Mongols weren't wasteful. Blood was collected to make sausages, organs were eaten or preserved, bones were cracked open from marrow or used in soup. They butchered their animals with almost surgical precision, often making a chest incision and stopping the heart manually, preserving every drop of blood. This method stood in contrast to Islamic halal practices, which emphasized blood draining. Sometimes Mongol rulers even forbade halal slaughter as a way to assert cultural dominance. Yes, food was politics. By now, your stomach might be growling or turning, but this was the fuel of conquest. This jerky, whether drying on ropes or slowly tenderizing under your saddle, helped power cavalry units across thousands of miles of rugged terrain. It let them avoid cumbersome supply chains. It let them disappear into the horizon and strike with terrifying speed. Their enemies couldn't keep up because they needed wagons, carts, campfires. You just needed a few strips of meat and a good horse. You lean forward now, your fingers brushing the leather pouch beneath the saddle flap. It's warm. Maybe too warm, but that's part of the charm. You ride with your meals. You live with your food. You are your supply line. And as odd as it sounds, Mongol warriors didn't see it as gross. They saw it as efficient, logical, even intimate. Your horse gives you transport, warmth, status, and dinner. It's a relationship built on survival. So you chew, you ride, you live. The wind picks up again, carrying the scent of sage and sweat and faintly cured mutton. A hawk circles high above. The sun dips toward the jagged horizon, turning the grasslands gold. And as you let your mind drift with the swaying rhythm of the steppe, you realize you've joined a tradition as old as the empire itself. Not every empire leaves behind marble palaces or golden crowns. Some leave behind tough strips of meat, drying quietly beneath saddles, waiting to be eaten in the long silence between wars.
The stars begin to fade as the sky turns steel blue. The grass around you stiffens with frost, your breath puffs white, and the world feels cold enough to crack. There's no fire, no campsite, no cooking pot clanging in the wind. Just you, your horse, and an early morning hunger that bites harder than the chill. You lean forward, stroke the mare's neck, and murmur gently. She snorts once. Then you slide a slender blade from your belt. This is not a story about butchery. It's about survival. You locate a thick vein on the mare's neck, press the tip of your blade against the skin, and make a careful, practiced nick. The blood wells up instantly, warm, thick, bright with life. You hold your bowl steady, letting it fill just halfway before binding the wound with cloth and pressing it firmly. The mare shifts, but does not panic. She's done this before. She's a Mongol horse, bred for war, storms, and hunger. You lift the bowl to your lips, steam rises, you drink. Yes, this really happened. Mongol warriors, on long rides or in desperate times, would draw blood from their horses and drink it to stay alive. It sounds savage, sure, but don't picture vampires. Picture endurance athletes, mountaineers, survivalists. For the Mongols, blood was food, warm, nourishing, full of protein and iron, a calorie boost you could carry in your veins or harvest from your horse. Historians still debate how widespread this practice really was. Some believe it was a desperate measure, only employed in extreme conditions, sieges, winter rides, or raids gone wrong. Others suggest it was routine, not just a last resort, but a smart adaptation. After all, when you ride with 5 or 6 horses per man, a single nick from one doesn't harm the herd. And the payoff? Immediate energy, hydration, and body heat. What makes this even more brilliant is how the Mongols combined it with other foods. Sometimes they mixed the blood with milk, creating a rudimentary, high-protein smoothie. Blood and kumis? Not exactly Starbucks material, but incredibly effective. It added iron to their otherwise dairy-heavy diet, and in cold weather, it brought vital warmth to the gut. In fact, fresh blood contains small but significant amounts of vitamin C, just enough to fend off scurvy when plants weren't available. You heard that right. They were fighting vitamin deficiency with horse blood. Bet your multivitamin never had that on the label. And it wasn't just horses. Mongols also consumed the blood of sheep, goats, and cattle. When animals were slaughtered, nothing was wasted. Blood was often collected, mixed with chopped fat and meat scraps, and stuffed into intestines to make sausages called geddes. These could be smoked or dried like borts, becoming part of the traveling pantry. But the horse blood drink, that was something special. It wasn't about abundance, it was about endurance. Marco Polo and William of Rubruck both documented this practice with a mix of awe and horror. Polo noted that when Mongols had no food, they would open a vein in a horse and drink the blood. Rubruck, more dramatic, described how warriors could survive for 10 days with no food but their horse's blood. Neither of them understood the quiet genius of it, a renewable, portable, clean source of nutrition in an otherwise hostile environment. Your mare nuzzles your shoulder as you wipe your mouth. She's calm now. The nick on her neck will scab over in an hour. She won't miss the blood, but you'll remember the warmth it gave you as you ride into the cold dawn. And the Mongols weren't the only ones to do this. The Maasai in Africa also drink cow blood for nutrition. In Arctic cultures, fresh animal blood is prized as a survival food. What sets the Mongols apart is how seamlessly they integrated it into their cavalry strategy. You could travel for days, even weeks, without stopping to cook or resupply. As long as you had a healthy horse, you had a lifeline. That's why Mongol warriors often had a string of remounts, 5, 6, sometimes even 10 horses per rider. Each one served a purpose: speed, endurance, burden, or blood. You didn't ride them all at once. You rotated, rested them, used them strategically. Your herd was your pantry, your muscle, your heater, your escape route. A tired horse was a resource, not a liability. But there was an emotional component too. Mongols had deep, almost spiritual bonds with their horses. These weren't disposable tools. They were companions, symbols of status, and sources of livelihood. To draw blood was not a betrayal. It was a pact. You don't kill the horse. You ask it for help. And in return, you feed it, shelter it, protect it from wolves and arrows. It's a mutual understanding built over thousands of years of steppe culture. And while the idea of drinking warm horse blood might send modern readers running for a juice cleanse, consider the context. You're in sub-zero temperatures. You've ridden 80 miles today. Your last meal was 2 days ago. You can't build a fire. You're out of borts. And then you remember the mare beside you, the steady heartbeat, the soft eyes, the warmth under your hands. You reach for the blade. Is it brutal? Maybe. But it worked. And it kept an empire on the move. As the sun rises, gold spills across the steppe. Faint bird song stirs in the distance. You toss the empty bowl back into your saddlebag, feeling the heat spread through your chest. Your stomach no longer aches. Your limbs feel steady. Your mind sharpens. In the saddle, the world moves with you. You ride. And you carry a little piece of your horse with you. Not in some poetic way, but literally. Your strength is shared. Your survival is shared. And the empire that arose from this blood and milk bond would stretch across continents, leaving awe, fear, and legend in its wake. You turn your head. Far behind you, a line of riders crests a hill, silent silhouettes against the morning sky. Ahead, endless grasslands beckon. Your mare exhales once, and you urge her forward. There's no stopping, only motion, only momentum. The blood in your veins pulses to the rhythm of hooves.
The sun climbs higher now, casting long shadows across the wind-brushed steppe. Your mare plods along with practiced rhythm, and your stomach grumbles again, not with desperation this time, but with a more persistent kind of curiosity. You reach into the leather pouch strapped to your belt and feel them, tiny, hard, knuckle-sized lumps that clack together like pebbles. You grab one, pop it into your mouth, and immediately regret it. It's dry, it's sour, it's harder than stone, and it's definitely not candy. You bite again. Still no give. You suck. You wait. Finally, the outer layer begins to soften. A faint tang of aged milk seeps into your taste buds, and slowly, very slowly, it turns from rock to food. This, my friend, is karut, or a rule, depending on who's asking. It's the Mongol milk pebble, and despite its uninspiring first impression, it's one of the most ingenious survival snacks ever invented. Let's rewind. Remember that in the Mongol food calendar, the warm months were all about the white foods? Milk, cheese, yogurt, butter, and everything in between? During summer, livestock are lactating and dairy flows abundantly. But summer doesn't last forever. What do you do when the grass withers, snow buries the world, and the cows run dry? You make korut. The process begins with sour milk, either goat, sheep, or cow. Mongols didn't fear fermentation, they embraced it. The milk was either allowed to sour naturally or was curdled using starter cultures, sometimes even bits of old yogurt or rennet. Once curdled, it was gently heated, separating the curds from the whey. The curds were pressed, kneaded, and squeezed until all the liquid was gone. Then came the fun part, shaping. Tiny balls, flat discs, twisted spirals, animal-shaped lumps for children. Mongol hands shaped the future, literally. These curds were then laid out on the felt roofs of gurs or on woven mats in the sun, and over several days, they dried into hard, chalk-white nuggets. The final product was light, portable, virtually indestructible, and could last for years, yes, years, without spoiling. And though it might feel like gnawing a rock at first, korut packs a nutritional punch. High in protein, rich in calcium, and full of probiotics, it helped Mongol riders maintain bone strength, gut health, and energy on the move. 10 pounds of this stuff could provide hundreds of grams of protein and thousands of calories. Think of it as the yogurt raisin's jacked up older cousin, minus the raisin part and minus the soft. Marco Polo described dried milk curds as a staple field ration, often carried alongside borts and kumis. In fact, he claimed that with a little water, a few pebbles of karut, and some dried meat, a Mongol could make soup for days. Just toss the curds into hot water, stir them in, and boom, instant steppe stew. It was the ultimate just-add-water meal kit before freeze-drying was even a thing. Now imagine a Mongol warrior bumping across frozen plains, wind screaming past his ears, and his only meal for the day is a few dried curds and a swig of erig. Not glamorous, but practical, reliable. It worked. And these weren't just snacks. Kurut had cultural significance too. Sharing your dried curds with a fellow traveler, that meant trust. Giving a pouch to a departing family member, that meant care. They were even included in bride prices and ceremonial feasts. Hard cheese, hard feelings, hard life, but somehow that makes it more meaningful. You suck on the curd a little longer and your jaw begins to ache, but you're strangely comforted. The sour tang grows pleasant. You remember how women were often the masters of dairy transformation, churning, shaping, drying, preserving. In many ways, they were the silent engineers of the empire, ensuring that warriors had food, children had nourishment, and rituals had meaning. Even today, if you visit the steppes of Mongolia or rural parts of Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, you'll still find kurut in markets, in homes, packed into little bags with brightly colored stitching. It's the same as it was 800 years ago. And yes, it's still rock hard. Modern Mongols sometimes soak them in tea, crumble them onto noodles, or offer them with sugar. But the essence remains: preservation, endurance, tradition. Historians still debate whether these curds were invented during the Mongol era or earlier. Some argue their roots stretch back to the Bronze Age. Others think they were perfected during the imperial campaigns, when mobility demanded food that could survive months in harsh conditions. Either way, their legacy is unmistakable. You take out another one, roll it between your fingers, and crack a small smile. They're addictive in the weirdest way. One more bite, one more chew, one more strange moment where history sits on your tongue and dares you to understand it. And let's not forget the logistics. These little curds didn't spoil, they didn't require cooking, they didn't leak, drip, mold, or rot. They didn't weigh much. A pouch of kurut could ride in your saddlebag, survive rain, snow, sun, and saddle sweat, and still be edible a year later. It was a warrior's cheese. No frills, no mercy. But perhaps the most charming detail? The way they rattled. Tucked in leather pouches, bouncing on a trotting horse, the kurut would knock together with a rhythmic clack, like tiny cowbells. It was the music of the road. Riders could identify a familiar comrade by the sound of his curds. Children listened for the jingle as their fathers returned home. Imagine that. The gentle clatter of dairy pebbles as a symbol of safety, routine, and nourishment. So you ride now, the crunch of kurut between your teeth, the landscape unfurling ahead of you like an ancient carpet. There are no convenience stores, no ration packs, just you, your horse, and the hard-earned wisdom of the steppe. Food doesn't have to be easy. Sometimes it just has to last. Sometimes it has to remind you who you are. And sometimes it has to survive a thunderstorm, a blizzard, and a 200-mile ride without batting an eye. That's kurut for you.
The wind picks up again, this time cooler, sharper, laced with the scent of river water and burnt wood. You tighten your cloak and dismount beside a patch of stunted trees near a trickling stream. You're hungry, again, and this time, jerky just won't cut it. Your saddle-cured meat is dry, your curds are crunchy, and the blood's long digested. What you want, really, is something warm, something steamy, something that doesn't chip your teeth. And so, like a true steppe survivor, you get out your pot, gather stones from the riverbed, and get ready to cook the old-fashioned Mongol way with boiling rocks. Yes, boiling rocks. It sounds like a campfire myth, but it's not. Mongol warriors on campaign didn't always have the luxury of firewood or metal cookware. What they often had was a leather bag or rawhide container, some river water, a few scraps of meat and fat, and a whole lot of stones. Enter the stone-boiled stew, a culinary marvel of desperation, creativity, and genius. Here's how it worked. First, find stones, smooth, river-worn, preferably rounded so they don't puncture your pot. Then, build a fire, using dung or dry brush if needed, and heat the stones in the flame until they're glowing red or hot enough to hiss. Drop your meat and fat into a rawhide or stomach skin pouch, add cold water, and then drop in the rocks. The heat from the stones instantly raises the water's temperature, and before you know it, you're cooking. Steam rises, the pouch bubbles, the meat sizzles slightly. You swirl the pouch gently to avoid scalding or tearing, and within minutes, you've got a broth. Basic, but hearty. Add wild onions or garlic if you foraged any, maybe a bit of millet from your grain pouch. And if you're feeling fancy, crumble in a pebble or two of korut for tang and protein. That's it. No pots, no pans, just hide, fire, and rocks. This method wasn't just a clever hack, it was essential. The Mongols didn't lug iron cookware on long campaigns. It was too heavy, too loud, too fragile. Instead, they carried stone-friendly pouches and adapted to their environment. Hide, after all, can hold water if cured and sewn properly. And hot rocks? Well, nature supplies those in abundance. Historians still debate whether stone boiling was a daily routine or a fallback method. Some suggest it was used primarily in river valleys or forested zones where stones and water were abundant. Others believe it was an all-purpose technique, employed anywhere a fire could be lit and a riverbank scoured. Either way, it reveals something vital. The Mongol diet wasn't just about ingredients, it was about method. And what they lacked in seasoning, they made up for in ritual. Cooking, even this roughshod version, was often communal. A group of riders might stop, circle the fire, and toss their rations into one shared pouch. The fire crackles, the pot bubbles, and everyone watches, waiting for the moment when someone scoops the first ladle of soup. It's not just food, it's camaraderie, a battlefield bond brewed over a boiling stomach bag. You take a sip now, careful not to burn your tongue. The broth is thin, but nourishing. Bits of borts have softened into shreds. The fat has melted into an oily sheen. The korut adds a tangy sharpness that cuts through the richness. It tastes of smoke, stone, and satisfaction. This kind of cooking, minimal, mobile, and nearly indestructible, helped Mongols thrive in places where traditional armies would have starved. Imagine a Chinese infantry column with grain wagons and cooking pots, or crusaders building full kitchens in their camps. Mongols, they stopped for half an hour, boiled a pouch with rocks, ate, and rode on. That's how you cover 100 miles a day on horseback, by cooking on the go without breaking stride. And it's not just a matter of speed. This kind of food, hot, soupy, and fat-rich, helped keep soldiers warm in sub-zero temperatures. A belly full of hot broth made from fatty mutton and marrow-laced bones, that's central heating for the soul. It helped prevent fatigue, frostbite, and collapse. You didn't just eat to survive, you ate to ride. You glance around the makeshift camp now. Stones hiss softly in the cooling water. The rawhide pouch sags, its job done. A few bones rest nearby, gleaming white from boiling. There's no trash, no mess, no trace. Within minutes, you'll be back on the horse, the campsite erased, your breath the only lingering vapor on the morning air. The beauty of the system lies in its sustainability. Stones are reusable, pouches dry quickly, bones can be chewed, cracked, and burned. Nothing is wasted. Even the steam has value, softening hides, warming hands, lifting spirits. In a world of limits, the Mongols found abundance not by storing more, but by needing less. And the sound of this kind of cooking, it's soothing. The quiet clink of hot stone hitting water, the low gurgle of meat shifting in broth, the occasional hiss and puff of steam rising into the cold air. For people in constant motion, this was a kind of silence, a moment of stillness that said, we're fed, we're alive, we keep going. There are echoes of this technique even today. In parts of Mongolia, stone-boiled dishes like korhog are still made, usually with goat, onions, and a metal pot.
The same principles apply. Hot stones, sealed container, high pressure cooking. It's a dish saved for special occasions, but its roots stretch back to this battlefield broth, a legacy of survival that became celebration. So you sip again, feel the warmth travel down your throat, and smile. It's simple. It's strong. It's history in a pouch. You don't need a restaurant. You don't need a kitchen. You need fire, water, stones, and time. The stew finishes. You drink the last drop. The pouch is rinsed and packed. Your horse paws the ground, ready to move. You swing into the saddle, stomach full, heart light. Somewhere far away, a falcon wheels through the sky, crying once before disappearing into the blue. You ride again. Not fast, not yet, just steady, with a belly full of stone-boiled wisdom. The sky turns a pale, frozen blue as you ride northward, wind biting at your cheeks, your breath visible in sharp, short puffs. The trees thin, the grass browns. The world becomes quiet, except for the crunch of hooves across frost-hardened soil. You feel it in your bones. Winter is coming. And that's when you reach into your pouch, not for jerky, not for karut, but for something far more precious. A junk of sheep fat. Waxy, pale, and oddly fragrant, it's dense with stored energy. You shave off a sliver, drop it into your mess pouch with a handful of cracked millet, and begin the slow ritual of making the Mongols' cold season miracle, fat tail soup. It's not glamorous, but in the icy months, it's pure gold. See, Mongols weren't just eating to fill their stomachs. They were eating to survive sub-zero nights on open plains, wind howling through their gurs, frost building inside their sleeves. And the best weapon against that cold? Fat. Specifically, the fat from a very particular animal, the fat-tailed sheep. These weren't your everyday woolly lawnmowers. Fat-tailed sheep were bred for hardiness and, more importantly, for their rear ends. Broad, jiggling reserves of thick, creamy fat. A single sheep could carry up to 30 pounds of it. That's not an exaggeration. Mongol shepherds prized these fatty deposits like gold, rendering them down and storing the clarified result in leather pouches or even cleaned intestines for travel. And yes, it traveled well. Rendered sheep fat, unlike fresh meat, doesn't spoil quickly. It stays stable for weeks, even months in cold weather. In times of scarcity, it became the base of many steppe stews, mixing with millet or rice when available, and sometimes with dried blood or bones for added richness. The result? A rich, oily porridge with a calorie count that would make modern dietitians faint. But Mongols weren't counting calories to lose weight. They were counting to stay alive. Historians estimate that an active Mongol male required around 3,600 to 4,000 calories a day during cold weather campaigns. Fat is the most efficient way to reach that number. Just 100 grams of rendered sheep fat can pack over 900 calories. Compared to bortz, karut, or millet, fat is a fire in the belly. It slows digestion, sustains warmth, and fuels long hours in the saddle. You take a sip of your broth now. Millet softened to mush, a shimmering film of oil on top. It tastes earthy, salty, slightly gamey, but it hits differently. The warmth spreads, not just in your stomach, but in your shoulders, your fingers, your bones. Mongol warriors called this the inner fire. It wasn't just poetic, it was metabolic truth. And this wasn't accidental. Fat-tailed sheep weren't chosen at random. Mongol herders carefully selected for this trait over generations. The animals grazed easily, required minimal shelter, and could thrive on rough forage. In the southern regions, camels were favored, but in the north, sheep and goats dominated. These sheep were walking storage tanks of survival fuel. Slow-moving, yes, but reliable. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Mongols depended on fat-tailed sheep versus other fats, like those from horses or cattle. Some believe fat-tailed sheep were a later adaptation.
Others think they were part of steppe diets for over 1,000 years. What's clear is that by the time of Genghis Khan's conquests, fat had become a core strategic resource. And it wasn't just used for cooking. Rendered fat was sometimes spread on boots and weapons as a waterproofing agent. It was offered to spirits in fire rituals, given to the sick, or rubbed onto frost-bitten limbs. It was considered a sacred gift in winter weddings, a substance so valuable that even its scent was linked to abundance and health. You lean back slightly in the saddle now, the steaming pouch tied to your saddle horn, your breath curling into the frozen air. A memory stirs, a passage from the secret history of the Mongols, where a young Temujin survives a harsh winter on little more than dried meat and thick sheep grease melted into porridge. It's not gourmet, it's not glamorous, but it worked, and it built an empire. Fat also acted as a reserve. When food was plentiful in the summer, Mongols ate less fat and more dairy, but in the winter they shifted, storing fat, rationing it, planning ahead. This seasonal adaptation was part of a broader rhythm: white foods in the warm months, red foods in the cold. It was nature's menu, and the Mongols knew it by heart. And that millet? It's not a random grain. Lightweight, high in fiber, and easy to cook, millet was often the only grain carried into the field. It cooked fast, required little water, and mixed well with everything, from meat chunks to curd pebbles to rendered sheep fat. You stir your spoon now and watch the grain swell, oily and soft. This isn't just a meal, it's a system. In fact, archaeologists have found millet residues in Mongol cookware, confirming its regular use. Even more, isotope analysis of Mongol-era skeletons shows traces of millet consumption, particularly in regions where it could be traded or taxed from sedentary agricultural populations. It was the perfect complement to a fat-heavy diet, balancing digestion, stretching calories, and adding bulk to soups and stews. Now imagine a squad of 10 riders, an arban, the Mongol army's smallest tactical unit, stopping just long enough to melt snow, heat rocks, and boil a shared pouch of millet and fat porridge. They pass the bowl, eat quickly, scrape it clean, and mount again. No waste, no delay, just warm bodies and full bellies ready to ride another 50 miles. You finish your own bowl now, licking the last film of fat from your fingers. It's not just satisfying, it's stabilizing. It anchors you in the cold. It tells your brain, we're safe for now. And as your horse huffs white clouds into the air, you begin to understand why Mongols feared hunger less than cold, and why they treated fat not as a luxury, but as armor. The steppe teaches you this lesson. Survival isn't about eating well, it's about eating smart. And when winter claws at your bones, no roasted chicken or rice pudding will save you. But a belly full of sheep fat? That just might.
The wind shifts again, less biting now, more fragrant. You pause, catching a whiff of something sharp and green. It's faint, almost hidden under layers of dust and cold air, but there it is, a promise of flavor. You dismount, kneel, and part the withered grass to reveal a clump of wild onions, tiny, pungent bulbs with thin green stalks. You pluck a few, rub the dirt off on your sleeve, and nibble. Spicy, bright, alive. Welcome to the secret spice rack of the steppe. While Mongol cuisine is often painted with broad strokes, meat, milk, fat, what often gets overlooked is the subtle but essential role of foraged and fermented foods. These weren't luxury additions. They were survival tools. And tonight, under this pale sky, you're about to taste their hidden magic. Let's start with the forage. Mongols were masters of their land, reading it like a moving map. They knew which valleys sprouted spring herbs, which ridges hid wild garlic, and where pine forests dropped edible needles rich in vitamin C. You nibble one now. Sharp, citrusy, almost resinous. Not exactly a snack, but in the right broth, these needles brighten the whole bowl. More importantly, they fight scurvy, a slow and painful killer that plagued many armies, but left Mongols relatively untouched. Historians still argue how deliberate this was. Did Mongols know they were preventing disease, or were they simply adding flavor to monotony? Some say it was just intuition. Others claim oral tradition carried deep medicinal knowledge from generation to generation. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: vitality in the dead of winter. And then there's fermentation, a culinary magic trick that turns perishables into powerhouses. We've already met kumis, the lively fermented mare's milk, but Mongols didn't stop there. Turnips, cabbages, even wild berries were occasionally buried in cool earth or stored in sealed leather sacks to pickle slowly over weeks. These weren't elaborate dishes, just simple acidic solutions that preserved food, improved digestion, and offered rare bursts of brightness in an otherwise heavy diet. Imagine riding through endless brown hills, your tongue dulled by dried meat, and then tasting a tart, briny slice of turnip that awakens your senses like a slap. That's not just food, it's morale. Today, in the highlands of Mongolia and Siberia, you can still find remnants of these traditions. Travelers might be offered pickled cow's ear, fermented barley tea, or sour yogurt with ground herbs. The techniques haven't changed much. Bury it, seal it, wait. But the wisdom behind them is eternal. Preservation wasn't just about survival, it was about sustaining complexity. You crunch another wild onion bulb between your teeth and remember this. Mongols weren't chasing gourmet dreams. They were building meals from what the land whispered to them. Some foraged foods also doubled as medicine. Juniper berries soothed coughs. Stinging nettle brewed into tea relieved aches. Wormwood, bitter but potent, was used to treat stomach woes. This wasn't a pantry, it was a pharmacy on horseback. And speaking of pickles, here's a fun one. Fermented horse meat. Yes, it existed. Small chunks of lean horse meat, salted, packed tightly into animal stomachs or pouches, and left to ferment slowly during long rides. The result? A sour, chewy protein bomb. Definitely an acquired taste. Definitely effective. Imagine explaining that to your dinner guests. It's a little funky. It's supposed to be. You might wonder how Mongols handled spoilage or foodborne illness. The answer is, they often didn't have to. The harsh climate preserved things naturally. Cold nights froze milk solid. Dry winds sucked moisture from meat. Acid from fermentation created hostile environments for harmful bacteria. And Mongol guts, toughened by generations of fermented dairy and barely cooked meats, were notoriously resilient. Your gut, modern and fragile, might balk. Theirs, it shrugged. Even their drinking water was treated with instinctive caution. In areas where rivers ran low or suspect, Mongols would steep pine needles, charred wood, or dried herbs into the water. Sometimes this was ritual, sometimes practicality, but the result was often a safer, more flavorful drink. And let's be honest, after 2 weeks of nothing but goat broth and curret, a pine needle tea tastes like a miracle. Fermented curds, too, had layers. Some were fresh and soft, eaten with spoons. Others were left to age in skin bags until their flavor turned sharp and borderline offensive, like blue cheese without the apology. But these aged curds lasted longest, traveled furthest, and were often traded between clans like precious currency. In fact, dried dairy was sometimes used in diplomacy, offered as tribute, barter, or tokens of peace. There's even a theory floating around that Mongol fermentation techniques influenced Russian and Central Asian food preservation methods. Is it true? Maybe. Historians debate it. But when you trace the paths of conquest, trade, and migration, you start to see echoes. Kefir, kvass, pickled fish, fermented vegetables, all with shared roots in ancient mobile cultures who understood that food must move with the people. You look at your own stash now. Wild herbs tied in a string, a pouch with pickled roots, a sealed bag of sour curd paste. It's not much, but it's powerful. These flavors don't just sustain, they surprise.
They cut through the repetition, reminding you that taste still matters, even in war, especially in war. That's the thing with Mongol cuisine. It wasn't just a means to an end. It had rhythm, complexity, intuition. They didn't hoard spices like Silk Road empires, but what they had, they used with precision. A pinch of dried garlic, a sliver of pickled meat, a few pine needles steeped in goat's milk. You weren't just filling your belly. You were crafting resilience, one bite at a time. And in this quiet moment, sipping pine tea and crunching a foraged bulb, you realize something else. The land is still generous. If you listen closely, if you move carefully, if you pay attention to what grows and when, it feeds you. Not in excess, but in enough. The Mongols knew this, and now, so do you.
You wake up with the light in your eyes and the ground vibrating faintly beneath your back. Not thunder, hooves. You roll to one side, brush frost from your beard, and listen. It's not a charge, it's a drift. Dozens, maybe hundreds of animals moving in rhythm. Sheep, goats, yaks, a few ponies. The low grumble of a herdsman singing somewhere in the distance. You rise, stretch, and remember, Mongol supply lines didn't move on wagons. They moved on 4 legs. You weren't just a soldier. You were part of a moving ecosystem. Welcome to the walking pantry. Where European armies relied on cumbersome baggage trains and imperial kitchens, the Mongols relied on their herds. Every unit, down to the smallest arbin, traveled with its own supply of animals. Meat on hooves, milk on demand, warmth wrapped in wool. Horses weren't just for riding, they were also for drinking. Goats gave milk, sheep gave fat, yaks gave strength, butter, and backup warmth. That's right, logistics Mongol style was alive. Self-renewing, self-walking, self-healing. If one cow limped, it was butchered. If a mare foaled, the milk doubled. If you were clever, you didn't just travel with food, you traveled as food. You were surrounded by the hum of survival. This system let the Mongol army do something no one else could: stay light, move fast, and never worry about supply lines breaking. If you lost your grain wagon, too bad. If you lost a sheep, you cooked it and kept riding. The numbers were staggering. An average Mongol soldier had access to 3 to 7 horses, and many units herded a mix of sheep and goats totaling hundreds. Multiply that by thousands of soldiers, and you have a thundering, breathing, grazing supply chain stretching from the Caspian Sea to the forests of Manchuria. Historians still argue about the exact ratios. How many sheep per rider? How much milk per day? Did herds always follow, or were they stationed at intervals? Likely the answer is all of the above. The Mongols were flexible, improvising as terrain demanded. In wide grasslands, they moved with large herds. In forests, they split into smaller groups, relying more on foraged goods. Their genius wasn't in rigid planning, it was in adaptive supply. You reach out now and grab a rope tied to your saddle. On the other end, a sturdy goat trudges behind you, calm as a pebble. She's given a little milk this morning, enough for a swig of warm froth straight from the udder. No pot, no ceremony, just nourishment. You wipe your mouth, pat her side, and keep walking. This bond between rider and animal wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Horses weren't merely mounts, they were companions. You learned to ride before you learned to walk. You knew which mare produced the best milk, which stallion ran furthest, which ones you'd eat last, only if winter got desperate. It wasn't just livestock, it was kin. And the milk? Mare's milk, goat's milk, even camel milk in desert regions. Every drop was churned, fermented, stirred, or drunk raw. It didn't matter. What mattered was portability. A small bag of dried milk curds could feed you for days. A single lactating animal could sustain a squad. Picture this: a warrior riding hard for 80 miles in a day, stopping briefly at midday. He hops down, milks his mare, mixes the frothy milk with a pinch of kurut, and drinks. 10 minutes later, he's gone again, hydrated, fed, and satisfied. No kitchen, no fire, no delay. You pull open a side pouch and reveal a block of butter wrapped in hide. It's yellow-white, smooth, and just soft enough to smear on a hunk of dried bread, if you're lucky enough to have bread.
More likely, you'll melt it into your millet tonight. Rich, greasy, and warm. Exactly what you need after a full day's ride. Of course, not everything was abundant. When animals got thin, when grass ran short, riders had to cull strategically. The youngest animals were spared, the weakest were used first. You learn to read a herd's health like a doctor reads a pulse. Too many limps, too much noise, not enough cud chewing, time to slow down. And sometimes tragedy struck. An early frost, a sudden storm, a wolf attack. Entire herds could vanish overnight. And when that happened, Mongols didn't panic. They adjusted, they shared, they swapped meat with dairy, borrowed goats from neighboring units, or, in desperate cases, raided enemy flocks. It's worth remembering, the Mongol way of war was built on mobility, but mobility depended on nourishment. No food, no speed. No speed, no empire. Every campaign was a ballet of hooves, grass, and timing. You couldn't just want conquest, you had to feed it. And that meant thinking 3 moves ahead. If a valley was overgrazed, you left. If a river was dry, you dug. If your goat refused to walk another step, you carried it or ate it. This was war in motion, fueled not by rations, but by relationship. One quirky detail: some Mongol officers trained their horses to drink slowly, sip by sip, over long periods so they wouldn't bloat or overheat. Others trained their goats to stay close during skirmishes, like portable canteens that doubled as alarms. Imagine galloping into battle with a goat tied to your belt. That's not something you see in your average medieval tapestry. By now, the herd has settled. The bleating quiets. A few animals kneel to rest. You count them quickly: 4 sheep, 2 goats, 1 donkey, and 3 ponies. Enough for meat, milk, hauling, and maybe an occasional awkward lullaby if the donkey starts braying at night. You pat the nearest goat, whistle softly, and look out over the hill. Beyond the ridge, you know there's another valley, more grass, another fire waiting. But for now, you rest in the rhythm of the living pantry, content in the knowledge that you're never far from your next meal, not in your bag, but walking beside you. That's how the Mongols conquered half the world, not with castles or catapults, but with 4 hooves, a nose for grass, and the wisdom to let the land move with them. The sky dims to a smoky gold as evening creeps across the steppe. Your pony huffs beneath you, snorting little clouds into the air. You've covered miles today, miles of grass, dust, and hoofbeat rhythm. As camp takes shape around you, you feel that familiar rumble in your belly. Not hunger exactly, expectation. Tonight isn't just about filling your stomach. Tonight is about something bigger, a ritual, a feast. Mongol armies weren't just relentless war machines. They were tightly knit communities, and food was the glue. The firelight glints off polished bowls as the first smells waft through camp. Roasted mutton, spiced curd, butter melting into thick, steaming stews. This isn't a casual meal. It's a performance, a reaffirmation, a moment when even warriors become family. Mongol feasts were structured, not chaotic, ritualized even. Everyone had a place. Seniority ruled. The Khan, of course, sat at the highest point, usually on a cushion or raised platform. His cup was filled first, his plate served with the choicest cuts, tail fat, ribs, tongue. The rest waited, not out of fear, but respect. This wasn't just dinner. It was governance in a bowl. Tonight's gathering feels especially solemn. The fire crackles. A hush settles as the eldest among you, a grizzled warrior with a white beard and cracked fingernails, raises a silver cup of arog and toasts the eternal blue sky. Everyone echoes the gesture, lifting their bowls high. A splash is poured onto the earth. For the spirits, for the ancestors, for the land that feeds. And then the eating begins. Boiled mutton is passed around in shared bowls, eaten with fingers or small knives. There are no forks, no formal plates. The meat falls apart, having simmered for hours with salt and wild onion. Someone passes a bowl of fermented curd, its tang balancing the richness of the meat. A goat's head is brought forward, cheeks and eyes offered to the most honored guest. You wince slightly as it's accepted with a smile. Mongol etiquette, after all, prizes humility, and wasting food is a near crime. What makes this all so extraordinary is how layered it is. A feast might look like simple meat and dairy, but beneath the surface, symbolism, hierarchy, memory. That tail fat you're chewing, it's a sign of respect. The sweet fermented barley drink you sip next, it might be brewed just for this occasion, honoring a victory, a marriage, or the birth of a foal. Historians still debate the exact etiquette of Mongol feasts. Some claim that only the Khan could initiate a meal. Others argue that leaders used feasts as tests of loyalty, watching who ate what, who offered gifts, who deferred. Some feasts were diplomatic events, drawing envoys from Persia, China, or Russia to taste steppe hospitality and leave impressed or intimidated. Even the seating was strategic. Allies close to the Khan, rivals further away. Elders near the food, young warriors at the perimeter. Conversations flowed as freely as the drinks. Politics, marriages, troop movements, hunting stories, ghost tales. And in the middle of it all, the food kept coming. There's a quirky tradition you witnessed tonight, the cork hog, a stone-cooked meat dish rarely made on the move but reserved for big occasions. Chunks of lamb, potatoes, and onions are placed in a sealed metal pot along with heated river stones. As it cooks, the steam and the heat from the stones create pressure, turning the whole thing into a tender, smoky stew. When it's done, you're handed a hot stone to hold. It's believed to bring health, heat, and good luck. You juggle it from palm to palm with a grin, even as the meat melts in your mouth. Mongol feasts weren't just about nutrition. They were about unifying identity. Across tribes and dialects, across mountain and desert, every group of warriors knew the taste of boiled mutton, the tang of curd, the order of the toast. The ritual was the same, whether you were on the banks of the Yellow River or the gates of Kiev. And then there were songs. As the stars rise overhead, someone begins to hum, a low, vibrating throat sound that grows into a melody joined by others. It's homey, Mongolian overtone singing, where one voice carries multiple tones. It's haunting, beautiful, as if the steppe itself were singing. A woman joins in with a morin hoor, the horsehead fiddle, its two strings vibrating like the wind across grass. You close your eyes and drift, the feast turning into a lullaby. Every now and then, an old warrior claps his hands and tells a tale, maybe of a hunt or of a winter so cold the soup froze midair. Maybe of Genghis himself, who was said to divide his best food evenly, even with low-born soldiers. True or not, the stories feed more than your belly. They feed your bond. Because feasting was also a performance of equality. Yes, hierarchy existed, but Mongol Khans often emphasized sharing. Leaders were expected to eat alongside their men, suffer hunger with them, celebrate with them. That's why every feast wasn't just a meal. It was a moment of balance between power and community. And sometimes there were surprises. Foreign spices traded along the Silk Road, a sweet made of dried milk and honey. Even a chunk of rice wrapped in leaves, possibly from a Chinese emissary's caravan. These rare flavors sparked murmurs and stories, whispered bets on where they came from. But the Mongol genius wasn't in the exotic. It was in the essential. The way they could make so much out of so little. The feast begins to fade now, bowls emptied, fires doused. You lie back, warm and full, hearing the last notes of the horsehead fiddle fading into the night. And you realize something. This isn't just dinner. This is history, alive, steaming, sung into the sky. You're not just learning about Mongol foodways anymore. You're living them.
Dawn tiptoes in again, brushing the steppe with a pale wash of light. A cold wind tugs at your blanket. You sit up slowly, still full from last night's feast, but your mind's already curious. What happens when the Khan himself hosts a banquet? What does his table look like, if a man who conquers continents even uses a table? Today, you'll find out. You've been summoned to the court camp, not a palace, but a grand ringed arrangement of the Khan's white yurts, each one a glowing dome of felt and bone, embroidered with dark red, bronze, and gold. Smoke twists from their peaks like questions rising to the gods. You walk through ranks of guards, attendants, grooms, and scribes. Horses stamp and snort nearby, tied in neat rows. Inside the great yurt, a different world. Silk banners drift in warm currents of air. Low tables, cushioned seats, and brass cups gleam in the golden firelight. And at the center, raised slightly above the rest, sits the great Khan. His robe is simple, but the belt buckle alone is worth a city. He nods once. That's your cue. You bow, not low enough to grovel, but deep enough to survive. The imperial feast begins. Unlike the soldiers' rough meals of mutton and curds, the court table is a tapestry of conquest. Here, you see foods plucked from every corner of the empire. Roasted quail from the Persian forests, dried apricots from Samarkand, honey-drenched rice cakes from China, fermented camel's milk from the southern oases, boiled yak tongue from the snowy north. It's like the empire itself is on the menu. But don't be fooled. This isn't about indulgence. The food is a map, a statement, a way for the Khan to show guests, generals, and foreign emissaries that everything they eat is under his hoofprint. Historians still debate whether this food was chosen for taste or symbolism, but many agree it was both. At your place is a brass bowl of borts, shaved dried meat rehydrated in a lamb broth, garnished with chives and a slick of fat. It tastes earthy, familiar, but the next bowl is startling. Sweet rice boiled in sheep's milk, speckled with ground dates and nuts. A Persian touch. The flavors are surprising, soft and strange against your toughened palate. You glance around, seeing others eye their bowls with the same hesitation. Not all Mongols were used to this level of variety. That's part of the ritual. The Khan's court didn't just feed people, it educated them. Imagine this. A visiting Russian prince chews nervously on fermented mare's milk cheese, trying not to gag. A Chinese envoy pokes suspiciously at goat head jelly. Meanwhile, Mongol generals toast with fermented camel's milk, pretending it's wine. Everyone is slightly uncomfortable, which of course is the point. The Khan is watching, always watching. How you eat matters. How you react matters. Diplomacy here is measured in bites and bowls. A particularly strange dish arrives. Duck eggs, pickled in vinegar and buried for weeks. The taste? Funky, creamy, almost sulfurous. You're not sure if you like it, but you nod approvingly. Good call. A courtier beside you whispers that this was a gift from a conquered province. Refusing it would be a quiet insult. Court feasts weren't just about nourishment. They were about power, performance, and unity. Rituals dictated who ate first, who toasted second, and who waited until the last scraps. Genghis Khan himself was known to test loyalty this way, offering fat-tail cuts to those he favored, observing who passed portions to others, who hoarded, who bowed. One strange tradition unfolds before you, the Kugin cup, a large bowl of fermented mare's milk, passed clockwise among the honored guests.
Each must drink without wiping the rim, without pausing. It's not about hygiene, it's about honor. You accept it with both hands, sip deeply, sharp, fizzy, warm, and pass it along, resisting the urge to shiver. The man after you belches softly, and a few others nod in approval. Later, the Khan himself lifts his hand. Silence falls. He speaks, not long but firm. A blessing, a command, a reminder that the empire must remain one body, one tribe. Then, as if to punctuate the thought, a final dish is brought out. Sheep's liver wrapped in caul fat, roasted on hot stones, and served in strips. Rich, delicate, reserved for closings. And then, the court singers begin. Not rowdy like the campfire songs of soldiers. This is operatic, epic tales sung in ancient Mongolic tongues. Stories of wolves and sky, of the first ancestors, of battles fought in frozen rivers. The Morin Kur wails low, weaves under the voices like a hidden river. The scent of lamb fat, juniper smoke, and sour milk fills your lungs. You realize that these feasts are as much archive as they are banquet. History isn't written in scrolls alone. It's tasted, chewed, toasted, remembered through repetition. Historians still puzzle over how much these court traditions influenced other cultures. Did Persian courts mimic Mongol toasts? Did the Russians adopt certain dining order after embassy visits? Did Chinese nobles adjust their banquet etiquette after embassy visits? Likely yes, but the direction of influence was as fluid as the drinks. And speaking of drinks, someone refills your bowl. It's not kumis this time, it's arki, a distilled spirit made from milk. Clear, potent, surprisingly smooth. It warms your throat and your chest, and you begin to understand why this stuff needs to be handled carefully. A little goes a long way. You stagger outside just before midnight. The stars wheel overhead, fires flicker across the court camp. Distant voices murmur lullabies to sleepy horses. You feel full, not just in body, but in meaning. This wasn't a feast. It was a strategy meeting wrapped in fat and milk. That's the genius of the Mongol court. It fed you, and it fed your allegiance. You walk to your tent with a slow smile. Tomorrow, you ride again. But tonight, you have tasted empire.
You ride again at dawn, eyes still glazed from last night's richness. The court yurt fades behind you, replaced by the familiar pulse of wind and hoofbeat. This morning, your destination isn't the Khan's tent or the foraging trails. It's somewhere even more intimate, into the saddlebag of a soldier. No ceremony, no silk, just survival, packed tight and worn raw. The Mongol warrior didn't march with a caravan. He galloped. He carried what he needed in leather pouches, gourd flasks, and clever folds of salt. You reach down now, unlatch the flap of your own bag, and peek inside. What does a Mongol soldier really eat on the move? Jerky. That's your answer. Lots of it. Known as borts, this dried meat was the backbone of Mongol nutrition. Made by slicing horse or mutton into long, thin strips and hanging them to dry in the wind, borts could last for months without rotting. No salt, no smoke, just sun, air, and patience. You grab a piece and chew. It's tough, chewy like rawhide, but savory and rich with the ghost of grassland flavors. It might not win awards, but it'll keep you alive. When boiled, a handful of borts transforms into soup. Add water, a stone, maybe a pinch of wild herbs, and suddenly you have warmth, broth, and morale in a bowl. Sometimes you crumble dried cheese into it, curute, to thicken the flavor, or melt in sheep fat for power-packed calories. Still chewing, you reach deeper and find a pouch of arul, rock-hard curdled milk solids. Imagine a snack that rattles like pebbles and tastes like salty chalk. That's arul.
You suck one slowly, letting it melt on your tongue like a tangy lozenge. It takes the edge off hunger. It takes hours to finish. It keeps your jaw moving when boredom or frostbite creeps in. There's a flask next, wrapped in felt and corked with horn. Inside, fermented mare's milk, arog, fizzy, sour, and shockingly effective at keeping your gut healthy. The first swig makes your eyes water. The second makes you grin. The third, well, now you're awake. This is what mobile war tastes like. Historians still debate the precise composition of the average soldier's rations. Was there millet? Some say yes, boiled with fat into a porridge. Was there honey or dried berries? Occasionally, if the terrain offered. But one thing is clear. The Mongol pantry was designed to move. No pans, no jars, no fancy preservatives. Everything dried, fermented, or born fresh from the animals around you. You pass another rider and notice him holding a strip of meat under his armpit, jerky in the making. The heat and pressure cure the strip as he rides. It sounds unappetizing, but when meat is life, you don't fuss about technique. He sees your glance and grins, showing a missing tooth and offering you a piece. You decline politely. Some warriors carried raw sheep fat wrapped in hide, not to eat immediately, but as an emergency ration. It could be melted into anything or eaten straight in desperate moments, a pure energy bomb. Then there are the real curiosities. One pouch holds dried wild onions, pungent and wrinkled. Another, tiny balls of pickled root, sour and sharp. Preserved vegetables were rare, but vital. They fought off scurvy and added a zing to otherwise monochrome meals. You tug out a flat brown cake, bortsog if you're lucky. It's a fried dough that sometimes survives long rides. Greasy, sweet, a miracle when it hasn't turned stale. Soldiers called them victory bites, a treat often saved for special days or good omens. And water? Scarce and sacred. Mongols knew how to find hidden wells, snow patches, or trickling springs, but they didn't rely on water alone. Milk was their lifeblood. Broths, soups, and even blood provided hydration in dire stretches. Camel riders especially learned to go without for long periods, sipping instead on concentrated dairy, or, if need be, nicking a vein from a riding horse for a few ounces of hot, life-saving blood. You pause now and look at your gear. No forks, no mess kits, just a knife, a pouch, and a stone. Meals happened in the saddle, on cliffs, by frozen streams or under moonlight. They were fast, functional, and fierce. But don't mistake this for meanness. Mongols loved good food. They simply learned how to enjoy it in motion. The saddlebag was both kitchen and cupboard. You were your own chef, and over time, your taste shifted. You began to crave the gamey twang of wind-dried mutton, the squeak of cheese rocks against your teeth, the hot grease that coated your throat after a meat-fat stew. Soldiers even had preferences. Some liked their borts thin and brittle, others preferred thick cuts with marbled fat. Some brewed tea with dried milk and salt. Others stirred curd into hot water for a quick drinkable soup. One fringe detail, some warriors believed that placing a rule under the tongue before a battle brought focus and calm. Others kept a special piece of jerky from their favorite mare as a good luck charm. You tuck your own little charm back in your pouch and smile. There's one last item in your bag, a needle and thread. Not food, but essential. You've used it to mend your boots, patch your saddle, and yes, even sew shut a pouch of spilled milk curds. Because in this life, everything is repurposed. Everything has meaning. As you ride into the wind, your saddlebag taps against your thigh. It's light, but heavy with survival. Not a banquet, not a famine. Just enough. Enough to ride, fight, rest, and ride again. That was the magic of Mongol military cuisine. It didn't ask luxury. It asked loyalty. Not to comfort, but to continuity. You take another bite of boards, let the wind carry away the salt, and ride on.
By now, your tongue has memorized the taste of jerky and cheese. Your hands know exactly where the saddlebag's hidden clasp is. Your stomach doesn't growl like it used to. It waits, patient, understanding. You've become, in your own strange way, a creature of the steppe. And it makes you wonder, how did they do it? How did Mongols thrive on this diet? A question as old as the empire itself. The answer begins with your next bite. Sheep fat melted into cracked millet. Not exactly glamorous, but when you're galloping across frozen plains, it's a miracle. This dish, simple, dense, strangely satisfying, holds a secret: balance. Despite lacking vegetables, fruit, or fish, the Mongol diet worked, and it worked well. Modern nutritionists scratch their heads over this. Where were the vitamins, the fiber, the leafy greens? Historians still argue whether the Mongols suffered widespread nutritional deficiencies, but the surprising truth is, they didn't. Not often, not consistently. Somehow, this high-fat, high-protein, dairy-heavy lifestyle kept people strong enough to fight battles, ride hundreds of miles a week, and build the largest land empire in history. So, how? First, milk. Fermented, fresh, boiled, curdled. Mongol dairy wasn't just cow's milk. It came from goats, sheep, mares, even yaks and camels, depending on the region. Each had its own profile of fats, enzymes, and nutrients. Mare's milk, for example, is lower in fat, but rich in lactose, which ferments easily and offers hydration with a probiotic kick. Goat's milk, a powerhouse of digestible fat and calcium. Cheese pebbles, arwol, held on to protein and calcium, becoming long-term stores of strength. Then there's the meat. Not grain-fed, hormone-pumped cuts, but lean, grass-fed meat from animals that roamed free. Sheep, horse, camel, goat, all had different fat compositions. Tail fat alone was like steppe butter, pure energy in a tidy packet. When you boiled it into millet or sopped it up with hard bread, it became the medieval version of an energy bar. Which brings us to millet. Yes, Mongols did eat grains, though not always daily. Millet grew easily in parts of Central Asia and China, and could be traded or carried in sacks. Boiled into a porridge with milk or fat, it provided carbs and slow-burning fuel. In some campaigns, rice or barley took its place, especially when local stores were captured. Still, vegetables were rare. So how did they avoid scurvy? Well, they didn't always, but fermented milk helped, especially fresh air egg, which retained traces of vitamin C from mare's milk. Add to that wild onions, pickled roots, or pine needle infusions gathered during slower seasons, and you start to see how they patch together micronutrients without gardens. Another unlikely source? Blood. Warm horse blood is rich in iron, B vitamins, and hydration. Mongols didn't waste life. They knew that a tiny vein nick at the base of the horse's neck could offer strength without killing the mount. A sip or two at dawn during famine or illness became tradition for some troops. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Was it ceremonial, regular, a last resort? But archaeological evidence of cut marks on horse bones and ancient texts, like the Secret History of the Mongols, support the claim. It wasn't barbarism, it was biochemistry. And what about gut health? With so much dairy, you'd expect disaster. But Mongols had been fermenting for generations. Their stomachs were trained. Their gut flora likely resembled a probiotic superhighway. They even knew which milks to mix. A little goat milk and mare's milk cooled the acidity. Adding cheese to soup mellowed its sharpness. There's even a quirky practice you've seen earlier. Before bed, an elder drops a pebble of arwol into warm water and sips it like tea. Keeps the bones from rattling, he grins. Maybe it's folk wisdom, Or maybe it's early calcium supplementation. And it worked. Mongols weren't towering giants, but they were robust. Their bones show strength, their teeth surprisingly intact. Compared to their European counterparts, they suffered less from cavities and tooth rot, likely due to the absence of sugar. Sweetness came in the form of rare honey or dried berries, both precious and minimal. You think now of the little kid you saw earlier, herding goats in the wind. No shoes, just a knife, a leather pouch, and a face smeared with dried yogurt. She's already strong, already quick, already part of a system that's kept people alive in the harshest of places for centuries. Still, there were limits. Extreme winters killed herds. Plagues swept through pastures. Some years brought famine, others salt shortages. But the Mongol genius was in mobility. When one region failed, they moved. Their food culture was built not on abundance, but adaptability. You didn't hoard, you hunted. You didn't plant, you planned. You didn't preserve with ice, you preserved with air. One soldier told you he hadn't eaten anything but meat and milk for 5 weeks. Then on a rave, he found a bag of Chinese dried plums. He cried, he admitted, and then he hoarded them. You both laugh at the memory now, even if part of you understands the depth of it. Food was emotional. It still is. In one fringe tale you hear tonight by the fire, an old writer claims that warriors would rub sheep's fat on their chests before bed to absorb warmth from dreams. No one believes him, but you smile, because in this world where survival dances so closely with tradition, even dreams can be seasoned. You lie back in the dark, hands behind your head, belly full of boiled meat and fermented milk. The wind whispers across your face, and your body somehow feels right. Not heavy, not aching, just balanced. Your heart beats steady. Your breath smells faintly of lamb. This diet, strange by modern standards, works. Not by luck, not by luxury, but by thousands of years of trial, error, and movement. You roll over, adjusting your blanket. Tomorrow you'll write again, and tomorrow your pouch of jerky will still be there. Your cheese pebbles, your sour milk, your strange, enduring fuel. The food of empire.
Morning greets you not with the clatter of hooves, but with the quiet hum of curiosity. The camp is calm, the fire's low, and the smell of leather and ash lingers in the air. Today, instead of galloping across open steppe, you step cautiously into the past, into the soil, into what's been left behind, and into the silent clues that tell the story of what Mongols really ate. You arrive at the dig site, a small wind-beaten cluster of canvas tents anchored beside shallow trenches. Archaeologists move slowly, like dancers in a sacred ritual. Their brushes sweep delicately across buried stories, and their fingers pause reverently when fragments of the past emerge. One waves you over. You kneel beside the edge of a pit and see it. A fragment of pottery, charred black, cradled in sand like a secret. It's not much, but it's everything. This shard, curved and fire-kissed, may have once held boiling millet, sheep fat, or fermented mare's milk. Its edges are etched with tiny marks, some ornamental, others purely functional. You trace one with your thumb. It's smooth now, but once it blistered with heat, alive in a warrior's campfire. Next to it, a small pouch lies open on a worn tarp. Inside, charred millet seeds. Microscopic analysis shows they date back over 800 years. Found nestled in an old hearth, these grains tell a story. Someone, likely a soldier, boiled them for porridge, perhaps with a splash of milk or pinch of salt gathered from a distant lake. And then they left, or died, or simply moved on. Bones are everywhere, split clean through, some sawed at the ends. Horse, sheep, goat, a few camel.
The telltale markings of marrow extraction are obvious. These were no ceremonial relics. These were meals, scooped, slurped, devoured beneath the stars. Mongols didn't waste. Every part had purpose. Even the bones that didn't feed the body fed the fire. And then there are the cooking tools. Iron knives, their edges still jagged with age. Horn spoons carved with worn designs, stone mortars cracked from use. One artifact stands out, a bronze kettle, scorched and stubborn, its bottom layered in carbonized residue. Scientists scraped it gently and discovered a long-forgotten stew, animal fat, wild onion, traces of pine resin, and something odd. Historians still argue whether that mystery ingredient was a wild garlic variant or a fermented tuber found only in high-altitude regions. Regardless, the evidence is clear. This was more than survival food. It was culinary strategy. Flavor mattered. Health mattered. Mongols didn't just eat. They seasoned, innovated, remembered. You move into another trench and hear excitement ripple through the team. A gourd has been unearthed, tightly sealed, its surface hardened by centuries. After days of careful coaxing, it opens. Inside, a pale, dry hunk of what looks like stone. But it's not. It's cheese. A rule. Pressed and sour, still recognizable. A food that could last months or centuries. A local herder joins the team and laughs when he sees it. "My grandmother still makes this," he says, tearing a piece fresh from his pouch. He offers you a bite. It's sharp, almost vinegary, but it tingles with resilience. You realize that what you're tasting isn't just milk, it's legacy. Later, you walk to a burial site just beyond the dig. The grave is simple. A warrior curled beside his horse's skull, a dagger by his hip. But what stirs you is the bundle tied to his side, a leather pouch still stitched. Inside, dried meat, bone shards, and 3 little cheese rocks. His final rations packed for eternity. Maybe he believed the afterlife would be long, or maybe he simply didn't want to arrive hungry. That night, you join the archaeologists around the fire. One holds up a set of ancient human teeth, stained, yellowed, but surprisingly intact. "Look at this," she says. "Minimal decay, no cavities. These people weren't eating sugar. Their diet was rough, but honest." And it shows. Flattened molars from chewing hard jerky, chipped enamel from gnawing on cheese rocks, slight jaw shifts from favoring one side. Some teeth even bear tiny abrasions, perhaps from grit and stone-ground millet or a sand-blown meat. One researcher jokes, "They probably flossed with horsehair." Everyone laughs. Maybe they did. And yet, for all the damage, their bones were strong, dense, healthy. A heavy meat and dairy diet should cause trouble, but it didn't. Not for them. Their gut bacteria had adapted. Fermented milk, probiotic curds, natural fasting cycles. The Mongol microbiome was a fortified army of its own. One fringe theory you overhear involves soot. Yes, soot. Some scholars believe that constant smoke exposure from yurts and campfires provided trace minerals like iron, magnesium, that incidentally bolstered their nutrition. It's not confirmed, but it's not entirely implausible either. In the Altai Mountains, where the wind cuts through stone like a blade, archaeologists once uncovered meat bundles wrapped in felt and tucked near permafrost. The setup was primitive, but genius. Layers of wool, snow, and shade kept goat meat half frozen and safe for weeks. This wasn't luck, it was intentional refrigeration, and it worked. Historians still debate whether this technique was widespread or elite, but even if rare, it shows a mastery of environment, using nature's extremes not as threats, but as tools.
As the fire burns low, you sit beside an elder archaeologist, wrinkled, wind-tanned, and still spry. He spent 3 decades chasing the culinary echoes of empire. You want to know what they really ate? He asks, eyes twinkling. Whatever kept them moving, whatever didn't spoil, and whatever reminded them of home. He lifts his cup, fermented mare's milk, pungent and fizzy, and sips. You do the same. The taste is wild, defiant, alive. That night, under the stars that once watched over khans and conquerors, you chew slowly. Not out of caution, but reverence. Every bite has history. Every scrap tells a story. And maybe, just maybe, someone centuries from now will find your bones and wonder what filled your belly on this night. Food isn't just fuel. It's a message, a whisper through time.
You wake to silence. No galloping hooves, no clang of kettles, just the hush of the steppe and the low whine of wind brushing across your yurt. It's your last morning in this world, the one built from saddle straps, fermented milk, dried meat, and fire-charred pots. You rise slowly, feeling the weight of time in your limbs. But there's one more thing to understand, something that won't be found in a potsherd or marrow-cracked bone. You mount your horse and ride, not far, just a little out, past the camp, past the dig site, until the only company is the sky above and the grass below. And then you see it. A small circle of yurts, not archaeological, but alive. Smoke curls from flues, children chase a goat, a grandmother squats near a pot. You've wandered into today's nomads. You dismount respectfully, greeted with cautious eyes and welcoming gestures. They know who you are. A stranger with questions. A student of what they call life. Inside one yurt, the fire burns low. On a short table sit our rule pebbles, a skin sack sloshing with arrog, and strips of horse jerky, curled like leather tongues. The family offers you tea, salty, buttery, brewed with yak milk. You sip. It's not what your palate expects, but it's real and ancient. This is the echo of empire. This is what survived. You bite the cheese. It crumbles and fights you, sour, dry, impossible to chew. A teenage boy laughs kindly and hands you a better piece. You try again. This one softens more. Second chew is always better, his mother says in accented English. Over the next hour, you help roll dumplings. Not the floury northern kind you know, but tougher parcels filled with meat and wild onion, sealed with fingers and baked beside stones. These are bortsog, the grandmother whispers. We still make them when the children visit. The children, her grandchildren, aren't here. They're in the city now. They have phones, eat noodles, love K-pop. But once a year they come. And when they do, she cooks like the wind will carry her memories into their bones. You ask about the food, how it's changed, what's missing. She shrugs. Some things stay, some go. The fat tail helps, the curds last, and we still bleed the horse if we must. You blink. Still? She nods. Only when needed. Only gently. The horse lives, but sometimes you need warmth inside. Blood is hot. You sit in that truth. Not barbarism, not cruelty, just a tradition of surviving where few others could. Historians still argue whether modern Mongol cuisine is a relic or a reinvention, but sitting here, you know it's neither. It's a continuation, a long, rolling feast across centuries, adapted by wind and war, held together by custom and cowhide. Before you leave, the grandmother presses something into your palm, a warm pouch of cheese rocks, for the road, she says. To remember. And you will. Every time you chew one,
Your jaw will ache, your lips will pucker, and your heart will hear hoofbeats across empty plains. As you ride away, the steppe stretches again into silence. No roads, no wires, just space. And your thoughts settle into rhythm, like hooves on firm earth. You remember the saddle jerky, softened by body heat, the mare's milk fizzing like yogurt kissed by storm clouds, the soup made with rocks, the lamb fat melting like gold into grain, the pine-sweet pickles hidden in saddlebags, the army that ran on rations packed in muscle, not mystery. And you remember the science, how they preserved, how they cured, how they thrived, the soot-fed minerals, the probiotic milk, the balance of fat and fire. They weren't guessing, they were engineering with instinct. Even today, scholars debate how the Mongols conquered half the known world. Superior tactics, ruthless speed, divine destiny? You know better now. They ate like no one else. Fast, light, fermented, focused. Every pouch a pantry, every horse a refrigerator, every bite a blend of survival and ceremony. They weren't just eating food, they were eating strategy. And now, beneath the open sky, you've eaten it too. So as the ride slows and the wind grows gentler, let your mind drift. Drift like smoke from a morning fire. Drift like wool blown from the back of a galloping yak. Drift like a memory carried in saddle leather across lands too wide for maps. Picture that circle of yurts again. The grandmother rolling dough, the boy chewing cheese, the fire crackling as lamb fat drips into millet. Picture the archaeologist brushing dust from a cracked kettle, her smile soft, her hands reverent. Picture yourself under that sky, the same sky Genghis Khan watched, the same stars that glowed over stews cooked with hot stones and broths made from marrow. And breathe. You don't need a horse now, or curds, or jerky stuffed in your shirt. You just need rest. Because even Mongols slept, even Khans dreamed, and somewhere between the fire and the frost, between the blood and the broth, they too whispered good night to the wind. Let your mind quiet. Let your limbs settle. You are full. You are safe. You have tasted time. Sleep now, traveler of the past. Tomorrow can wait.